We need a few more Richards in this conversation. Richard G, no less. Yeah.
Just to make it less confusing.
Yeah.
All right, Chris, I think I'm ready to go. I got 2 backup recordings going, so
okay. Well,
hopefully the technology gods are with us, and I'll let you moderate. I'm going to keep my comments to a minimum because I know James only has an hour, and people want to hear Richard and James. They hear plenty of me, so I'll save it for later on in the show.
That's great. I just want to start by thanking everyone for coming. We've got a really good turnout here. As you know, most people here are the autonomy class, and we're here with Richard Gage, architects and engineers for 9/11, James Corbett of CorbettReport.com, and Richard Grove, our host and navigator. Well, Richard Gage, could you just start by filling us in on what's going on with the Halsey report, maybe what it is and what you're hoping to do with it in September when you present it to the Attorney General, to give a bit of background on that, please.
You bet. This report is a major finite element analysis computer study by the University of Alaska. Professor Leroy Halsey, one of the top forensic structural engineers in the country, the Department of Civil Engineering, he's the dean of, well, the chair of. And getting a lot of background noise. I'll keep going then. It's too distracting, Chris.
Somebody is.
I'm not hearing it on my end, so.
Yeah, we've got some music going on.
Let me check the list.
It's the person called Case is causing the problem. Case.
Okay, Case, could you unmute, please? Sorry, Richard, go ahead.
Thanks. So this study, it comes from a very credible source, and we've got 3 years and $300,000 into it of the investment from those in the 9/11 Truth Movement. And Professor Halsey will be presenting at UC Berkeley on September 5th his conclusions. And of course, those conclusions have already been released. It is no surprise. Fire did not bring down World Trade Center 7, the 47-story skyscraper that collapsed on 9/11 in 7 seconds, straight down uniformly. After witnesses hear explosions, this building drops like a rock at free fall acceleration. So what can cause that? Not fire, and that's the official cause of this building's collapse, as stated by NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked by Congress to explain this collapse to the American people, which they ultimately did 7 years after 9/11. So this is an extraordinary set of circumstances, which we've been trying to blow the whistle on for 12 years now at Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, and on our website, ae911truth.org. And so this study now is in internal review by a group of 8 trusted technical experts in their fields, and it will be released on September 3rd, 4th, or 5th this year, just in time, of course, for the September 11th anniversary, the 19th anniversary. So this is a big deal. We will be sending 25,000 engineers across the country a postcard telling them about this study, encouraging them to look at it and to provide their feedback. And we will also be giving it to the U.S. Attorney, who has already promised in writing to impanel a special grand jury to look at the explosive evidence of all 3 World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. So we have a huge lineup of activities in September 11th, which also includes the 5 fire commissioners in the Franklin Square district in New York. And they have unanimously voted for a resolution demanding a new investigation of 9/11, citing our evidence and this study as key backup components for them. So all this is going to happen at the National Press Club in a press conference that we will bring the fire district commissioners to, along with Professor Halsey, ourselves, and a few of the key family members of the victims of 9/11.
What do we know about the U.S. attorney that is being presented to? Does a lot depend on their discretion? What do we know about that coming up?
Well, a lot of it depends on the discretion of the U.S. attorney. Theoretically, the grand jury process is independent of the judicial system. It's like a fourth branch of the U.S. government, according to U.S. Supreme Court Justice of late, Anton Scalia. So they have incredible autonomy if they act on that autonomy. They're also subject to manipulations by U.S. district attorneys and other district attorneys as well. So we have in writing a promise to impanel this special grand jury. There's been a conversation between the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry, which did all the legwork for getting this to happen. Them and the U.S. attorney, they have talked. And the U.S. attorney wasn't able to tell them anything of substance, only that to indicate that he's proceeding according to the law. That's all he could say. So we really don't know specifically what that means.
So
But
September 5th.
we do expect to be called as expert witnesses and to bring in this finite element analysis and have Leroy Halsey be called in also to show them that this, at least this third building, could not have been brought down by fire alone. And of course, we have the evidence for the Twin Towers, very explosive evidence with thermite, nanothermite, forensic evidence, etc.
James Corbett, any thoughts or comments on that?
I think these are all incredibly important developments, and obviously we're all waiting to see how they'll proceed. And I will refrain from being too cynical and prejudging things. I mean, we are now approaching the 20th anniversary in a couple of years here, so it's a long time to wait for justice. And one wonders at what point do we start losing the ability to actually achieve justice. But I'm glad there are people out there that are still attempting to achieve it while we still have that opportunity.
Richard?
That's right. There's plenty of reason to be cynical. There's skeptical, we'll say. There's also more reason to be hopeful. And I'll cite among the metrics for that speculation on my part, the support for AE 9/11 Truth. We received 120,000 hits on our website in the last, the 4 days following the release of the Fire District Commissioner's demand for a new. There's never been a legislative body. These commissioners are elected and by the people to represent them and in their fire district. And they have unanimously demanded a new investigation, citing the forensic evidence of an explosive evidence at the World Trade Center, Twin Towers, and Building 7. We have been overwhelmed with support for our part in developing these commissioners and that resolution and providing them with evidence and so forth for a number of months now. So I think it'll all, I'm going to be hopeful and say on September 11th at this press conference, the National Press Club, that the media will be forced to pick it up because of, if not because of the 3,000 architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth that we represent, who are also demanding a new investigation, but because of this unprecedented action on the part of fire commissioners, Christopher Gioia, the lead among them, who has stated that the head of the New York Association of Fire Districts has himself come out in favor of a new investigation. And I'm expected to speak early in September in New York at that body. and that's still being set up. We have been told by these fire commissioners that their grassroots work is very positive. So maybe it's just the time, you know. We know that Google and Facebook and Twitter have had incredible censorship capability over all of our work in this body assembled here. And I think despite that, somehow, by word of mouth, perhaps mainly, not necessarily as much on social media, but people are picking it up. And I believe 20 to 30% of the people are aware that that something's rotten in the state of Denmark here.
Richard, perhaps beside the point, but can you slake my own personal curiosity about the Franklin Square and Munson Fire District, which I understand represents an area in Queens. It's a hamlet of 30,000 residents just outside of Queens. Is that right? And it's a volunteer fire department.
That's right.
What was their role in 9/11 or the cleanup?
Most of them were at the cleanup. One of them, Thomas Hetzel, died in one of the towers, I believe it was. And his wife and his mother were at the presentation where this vote was taken. And they are the inspiration behind the movement there. I've talked with Chris a few times now at length, and this man is on fire. He's not going to stop until every firefighter in New York and outside of New York State has been made aware of this evidence. So does that help, James?
Yes, it does. Just the other follow-up question would be, do you know if any of these members of this fire department were stricken by the respiratory illnesses or any sort of health effects?
Given that there are a lot more firefighters who have died since 9/11, I mean after 9/11, than on 9/11 by far, I can only imagine that that's the case, but that's speculation on my part. I'll find out for you, though.
Yeah, please do. I'd like to know the sort of the personal story of some of the people involved in this. Clearly, as I say, beside the point, but still, that is one of the major neglected aspects of 9/11, which we tend to think of as a single point in time, a single thing that happened on a single day and had consequences out from there. No, there are, as you point out, many, many people who have died and or are dying from the health effects of that day and the lies, the documented lies that we know were told by the EPA and Christine Todd Whitman in the days and weeks following that event. So that's an extremely important part of the story that unfortunately doesn't seem to get a lot of coverage in the alternative media. So I like to try to bring attention to that when I can. Right
on. That's a great point. And that may have come out in the big meeting that they had there. I don't have, well, actually, that portion of the meeting was actually short. It only lasted about 7 minutes. It was simply a reading of the resolution and the vote, and then they went on to other business. So there was no public comment, no discussion, but certainly Christopher Joya will know the answer to that question. Great story, great idea for deepening the story.
Richard, you mentioned Marcelo Gadiana, who's doing a lot of research on the topic as well. Could you tell us a little bit more about him?
Marcelo was a student at Boston University, and he's a 9/11 truth activist who has specialized in digging in deeper to ACE Elevator. ACE Elevator had the contract for the modernization of these 100 elevator cabs in the two Twin Towers. They came out of nowhere to get this contract for the modernization, an unprecedented, the largest modernization in history. This probably should have gotten to Otis Elevator, who built these elevators and who had been maintaining them up until this time. But this company had this contract the 9 months prior to 9/11. And what's so interesting about this is that this could have given a group of operatives months in advance inside the core, the shafts with the elevator cabs, where the core columns are, to place critical shaped cutter charges, which we know the results of in terms of actual thermite, which is found by the USGS, for instance, the residue of thermite in all of these billions and billions of previously molten iron microspheres throughout all the World Trade Center dust. It's a key signature component. It's not even World Trade Center dust unless it has these unknown origin, previously molten iron microspheres. Well, where did the iron come from? We haven't built skyscrapers out of iron for hundreds of years. Well, 100 years. And so this is really key because this group, Ace Elevator, had 85 employees in the building at the time the planes hit, and they fled. They scattered like rats. It was quite a scandal documented by USA Today. And so this elevator modernization needs to be looked into. It was documented in March of 2001 in Elevator World. And that's where Marcelo got his start. And he's found out who was in charge of Ace Elevator and found out some very interesting facts about them, their ties to various organizations. And I'm not going to be saying any more about that, but we're looking forward to referring to an article which he intends to publish soon.
And wasn't there something about the armed guards at the elevators while it was being worked on?
Yes, they shut down various elevator hoistways in turn, and there were armed guards, and this is documented by witness Bill, I forgot his name. Anyway, that is documented there by this witness. I'll think of his name.
Just one more thought on that. So any of this evidence about the elevator debacle, but none of that will apply in September. There's not been any detriment, damning evidence with that yet that could be taken to the Attorney General, any of that.
Well, I think the Attorney General doesn't have to have damning evidence to present to the the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry, who filed this petition to the U.S. Attorney, doesn't need damning evidence to give them ideas about who these 23 grand jurors should be asking questions of and to and about. So they have included the Ace Elevator story to them, and some of those facts have already been given to the U.S. Attorney.
Okay. Any thoughts, James, Richard?
I'll leave it to James. Go ahead.
No, I'm very excited and interested to hear more about the Ace Elevator investigation. I'm hoping that such an article would be published in the Journal of 9/11 Studies or something similar to hopefully draw attention to that issue, because I think we do need some proper scholarly research on it. And
now I'll pick it back up. So I remember working in the World Trade Center, maintenance going on the spring of 2001, specifically because there's a bunch of elevator banks you can go up to, right? Go up to, there's 2 sky lobbies in the building. So you have to go up and then you get in another elevator, you go up and then you can get another elevator to get to the top of the building, unless you go up to the restaurant. One of the days, it's spring of 2001, I go to the World Trade Center, I get in the elevator. You can fit 8, 16 people in there if it's crowded. They're pretty big elevators, and they got doors on both sides. So you go in one side, you're in the car, and then you go out the other side, because you enter from the outside of the building, and when you get off the elevator, you're in the central core of the building. One day the elevators were going really, really slow, and people in the car were talking about they were working on the elevators and they had adjusted them and they were going too fast and somebody got hurt. I want to say that they got killed was the rumor, but I don't know that there's any evidence of that. But the story was, in the elevator, people talking, that somebody had gotten hurt. I don't know to what degree, but that was going on in the spring of 2001. So that's something I can corroborate.
Right. Well, I've heard similar stories. What's even, of course, more damning to the official story, and we should just mention it for those in your audience who are not familiar with this evidence. There's a team of 8 scientists led by Niels Harrit in Copenhagen who found in all the World Trade Center samples that he studied, and he was given 7 of them, these curious red-gray chips, about a 1/16 of an inch long, red on one side, gray on the other. The red side is composed of extremely small particles of iron oxide and aluminum powder. These are the ingredients of thermite. What are the ingredients of thermite doing in all of these chips that look like primer paint, but they're not primer paint because these are nanoparticles of iron oxide, aluminum powder. In a heater, they ignite and produce hundreds of, just on each chip, these small, previously molten iron microspheres. So they produce the exact same microspheres that are documented by USGS and RJ Lee, an independent environmental consulting firm. And so what are they doing in all the World Trade Center dust? These chips of nanothermite. This is documented in a peer-reviewed paper in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal. It is hard evidence that these towers were brought down by this special form of thermite and thermite, ordinary thermite as well. So that needs to be spoken, as well as the experience of hundreds of first responders and others citing explosions, hearing explosions, seeing explosions, being blown around in the building by explosions, and many of these before the tower even came down, because they're very precise in their order. They're like a train running underneath my feet, one of them says. It is incredible, these explosions. And then you look up and you see the tower exploding and coming down. So the basement explosions before the planes even hit, as documented by a dozen witnesses, including William Rodriguez. So all of these explosions and the visuals of explosions in all the videos, 20 stories down below the collapse, even up to 60 stories down below the collapse, all of these isolated explosive ejections called squibs in the controlled demolition industry. This is all damning evidence, and it's really only the tip of the iceberg. I mean, I spent 2 hours presenting this evidence to everybody, and I'm not repetitive. It goes on and on and on, and there's nobody that's not convinced by this evidence when we present it live in a group of newcomers to the evidence, particularly the architects and now the engineers through project due diligence. We present this to groups of chapters of the American Society of Civil Engineers, and they sign right up. They're on board. They see how faulty the NIST report was, for instance, because our engineers go through that, Roland Engel in particular, and now Leroy Halsey with the WTC7 finite element analysis. They're turning the profession around. They're receiving almost universal calls for a new investigation after these presentations. So we're very excited to have a renewal, if you will, of the successes in waking people up, particularly engineers, and hopefully soon, although I remain skeptical on this front, our legislative representatives seem to have been bought off. They just are not interested, though we will go back again on September 11th in the afternoon with Chris Joya and the other fire district commissioners, where we will have presentations, meetings with many elected representatives, and give our literature to all 535 members of Congress at the same time that afternoon. So we're looking for breakthroughs, but we're getting support of the 9/11 Truth Movement. We have almost 2,000 sustaining supporters at AE 9/11 Truth. So we're able to keep on going with this small staff of less than half a dozen of us, banging away all the time, wherever we can. And now with these big, heavy hammers.
Sorry, Richard Grove, can I just follow up a little bit? Because it's never actually occurred to me with your own personal experience in the towers. Can you corroborate either the armed security around various elevator upgrades or other work going on in the towers, and or the power down / security stand down that supposedly took place the weekend before 9/11?
All right. So the power down, I was not working in the buildings before. I left in June. So the power down the weekend before, I'd only seen the whistleblower reports. There was a guy involved who had reported that the power down. And what was the first part of your question?
The what had been raised earlier.
The armed guards.
Talking about armed guards around the elevator upgrade.
If there were armed guards, they weren't armed guards like we think of them. They were like street police, like they were like security guards, and they probably had weapons, but they weren't. I don't remember them ever being visible. I never saw anything that wasn't corporate in that lobby going into elevators. So if there was guys in like SWAT gear guarding an elevator, I'd have taken notice of that. So I don't remember ever seeing that. But again, I didn't work there every day. I went there like maybe 3 days a week. And so, and when I was going there, it wasn't really
the timeline that was up till June 2001, right?
That was up till June 5th was the last time I was there until September 11th. And well, actually September 9th, I had Windows on the World dinner. So between June 5th and September 7th or 9th, I think it was the 7th, was a Friday.
Right, because the 9th would have been the Sunday.
Yeah, 7th was
when the
Friday.
Power down supposedly was taking place. So.
Yeah, Friday is when I was there. Friday night. Windows on the World dinner. Trying to get a job. I got an offer too. It was a good dinner. Everything was good up until September 11th. Then things go sideways.
Yeah. Do we know when Marcelo Gariana's report will be out? Has he projected anything? Because we'd all be looking forward to that.
Yeah, I don't have a date on that. He's been lax on getting the progress made that I believe is needed to have more confidence. In other words, it's been a couple of years now he's been working on it.
Can we help him with it? Because he's in Boston. Like I could easily go interview him. And James and I know more about the who and why, whereas you've been very doggedly diligent focusing on the how.
Yeah, right? I would love to sick you on him.
For sure.
No, I talked to him last week. He said he'll get back on it, and so he's been saying that for a while, but this could really help Richard and James if you guys offer to not only help him in some fashion, but offer to publish or expose the results. I think that'd be very helpful.
I'd like to help make sure the results are as accurate as possible.
Mm-hmm.
If he's got some information, I just want to make sure that it's we connect the dots, make sure it's solid, that he's not publishing something that would be deleterious to your endeavor of building a solid case and focusing only on that solid case and not going after who did it or why they did it.
Right on.
What's RJ Lee, the consulting agency? What's their role now? They did 4 different studies on the thermite, didn't they? What role are they playing at the moment?
They didn't study the thermite. They studied the dust for toxicological issues.
How much dust are we talking about, Richard? How much dust was at the World Trade Center site? Just so people understand, the students have an idea.
Well, there was 90,000 tons of concrete, which was turned to dust. There's probably an equivalent amount of gypsum board that was turned to dust. And there were 1,600 people that we don't have a trace of. They were turned to dust. And lots and lots of other components in there, of course. So somebody's added this up. It's in excess of 100,000 tons for sure of dust, which spread across Lower Manhattan from river to river at 3
And
square miles.
To put it in human terms, I was just reading an article from, I think, 2002 about the dust and the issues that it was causing even at that time. And they were remarking on the Deutsche Bank building, which is just downwind from that site, where they were talking about the hallways being covered in dust, in some places up to 3 feet of dust in the building. So incredible amounts.
Yes, and one of the studies they did inside that Deutsche Bank building showed that up to 30%, or excuse me, up to 6% of that dust was previously molten iron microspheres. These are the diameter of a human hair, hard to see on average, hard to see by the naked eye, most of them. And yet they're very clear. R.J. Lee is absolutely clear, said these are formed during the event, not before by iron workers welding at the site during the erection, not afterward by the iron workers who were cutting apart the building, but during the event. Well, what could form molten iron during the event? Molten iron doesn't melt. Steel doesn't melt until about 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about 4 times as hot as these fires could have been, though NIST claims without evidence that they were 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. So this is complete speculation on their part, trying to begin to justify some of the molten materials is what they're really trying to do here. But they're still short 1,000 degrees in order to melt iron. And we're not just talking about spheres that were melted. We're talking about pools of molten iron documented by all kinds of structural engineers and iron workers and firefighters, including the World Trade Center structural engineer himself, Leslie Robertson, who says he saw a river of steel flowing. That's incredible. Well, guess what? Rivers of steel don't flow until you have 2,800 degrees. Kerosene, which is jet fuel, doesn't even begin to approach 600 degrees, actually is the maximum burning temperature in open air, according to its manufacturer. So we're still short. 25% is all of the heat required to melt all of this steel, which is also seen pouring out. It's really iron in this case, pouring out of the South Tower minutes prior to its collapse. All of this molten iron pouring. So this is not lead and it's not aluminum, as NIST claims. Aluminum doesn't glow bright yellow, bright white hot in daylight conditions. Neither does lead. So it can only be molten steel or iron. And there's no reason to think that it would be molten steel, given all the evidence for thermite, which releases molten iron as its byproduct at 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit.
Hot. Thoughts, comments, Richard, James?
Well, my first question is the study that Halsey, Dr. Leroy Halsey, has done at the University of Alaska. Did that go on concurrent or after we did the interview with the NIST whistleblower, Peter Ketchum? Because it seems like they go together very neatly. Two people that didn't know each other. Ketchum was a guy who worked at the NIST, and he reviewed the report and he was skeptical about it. And so he drew a number of conclusions. And so during the interview, I asked him, the NIST report on World Trade Center 7, did any of the data used for the report come from the site? Did they take it from the actual event, from the site where the building came down? And the answer is no. So from the start, their report was not built on reality. It referenced reality 0% of the time and was entirely structured around making that story that came out 4 days after the event to be true. And then with the Halsey presentation, he and his students recreated World Trade Center 7 in the software from the blueprints. And what they found was the difference between their model and the NIST model was there were certain reinforcement plates that were actually in the building that are missing from the model. And if you put those in the model doesn't react as they claim.
Yeah, this is just the beginning of the fraudulence of NIST relative to the Building 7 report that they made. They have an elaborate speculation that the fires, which they claim were very hot in that area on the 12th floor in the northeast section of Building 7, that these hot fires at the time of the collapse, which the photos and videos completely disprove, those fires were out an hour before that collapse. So they couldn't have been expanding these long span beams, which is NIST's whole theory, which then pushes this girder off of its seat on this column 79, and then causes floor 13 to fall onto 12, 12, and 11, and so on for 9 floors, leaving this column 79 unbraced for 9 floors, at which point it buckles, causing the inside cascading collapse of the northeast section of this building. And then this collapse travels laterally across this football-sized building. And all this happens in about 10 seconds. I mean, it's extraordinary. We're talking about a theory that requires the almost simultaneous failure of 400 structural steel connections every second. And the theory is completely fraudulent, and provably so, at every point along its path. For instance, the fires were out, as we mentioned. Those beams were fireproof. 2-hour fire protection on the steel beams in skyscrapers. That is a lot more fire protection than the 20 minutes of fire that there's fuel for. Even NIST acknowledges that fires in skyscrapers only last 20 to 30 minutes in any given area. And so here's that fire is gone well before it could have heated up these beams and expanded them. So they ignore the fireproofing. They ignore the fact that the fires weren't there. And then they put all this heat, nevertheless, in their computer model into the beam in 1.5 seconds. So that forces the beam to expand rather than sag, which is what it would have done if it was sustained in that length of a fire. So then, in order, as Richard pointed out, in order to get that girder to move laterally based on these expanding beams, they have to ignore the fact that there were 30 shear studs along its length, tying it to the concrete slab up above. So they just allow it to slide, which it couldn't have done. And the other point here is that even if it did slide, NIST says, well, the flange folded, the part of the beam that sits on the seat, on the column, it folded up. In other words, it didn't have to be pushed all the way off that seat. It only had to be pushed halfway off that seat, and it began to fold. But there were stiffeners, steel stiffeners, keeping that from ever happening. But NIST omitted those from their report so that they could have this folding flange, which then caused the girder to fall off of its seat. Well, even if the girder did fall off of its seat, we couldn't have had a complete collapse of of floor 13 onto 12, because there's 2 other massive girders tied into that column on the other sides of it. So that never could have happened. We wouldn't even have had the 13th floor hitting the 12th floor, much less with a dynamic load enough to break those additional 3 girders and with a shear force on them from above. It's all completely ludicrous. But even if that all could have happened, you wouldn't have had the internal cascading failure of these of this northeast section, because at that point you would have had the exterior perimeter structural steel frame being pulled inward. You would have telegraphed onto the outside what was happening. There would have been massive breaking up of granite panels and windows as a result, and crumpling like a beer can. We don't see any of that in the videos. This is a fraud from beginning to end.
There's a bit of action from the autonomy class. There's a question for you guys. Pam Batchelder says, why were the aerial photos taken by helicopter pilot Detective Greg Simendinger held for so long and released so late 9 years later? And also, why are the powers why are they withholding some of the pictures? Do you guys know any thoughts on that?
I don't have a comment on that. I'm not familiar with the helicopter photos particularly.
How about you, James?
I don't know the details of the helicopter photo in particular, but I was actually just thinking as Richard was speaking about some of the footage that has been released in recent years, FOIA'd, I believe, that was released in various forms and has been compiled online. And there is a YouTube channel that collects and compiles all the different versions of these videos that have been released. I can't, unfortunately, cite off the top of my head, but it is out there now. And one of the videos that came out in I would say in the past decade anyway, was some of the raw camera footage that was taken by, I believe, a Fox affiliate or something of that sort, who was in the area. This was clearly after the collapses, but before after the destruction of the Twin Towers, but before the destruction of WTC-7. And he goes around and goes up through the lobby, up the escalator, and you get a very good look at what WTC-7 looked like in that afternoon. I'm not sure exactly what time it was, but it was the afternoon before the building was destroyed. Clearly, there was some massive damage there. And I think the official story would be that damage, of course, was caused by the collapse of the buildings, and that was contributory to the failure that we saw later. Richard, what do you have to say to that or about that? Are you familiar with the footage that I'm referring to? I know I'm being rather vague because I don't have it in front of me, but I have definitely seen this in the last few years.
I don't think so. It sounded similar. Oh, I'm sorry. There's two Richards. It sounded similar to some of the shots that Nadays had going up the escalators after the one of the trade centers had come down. My thoughts were the other things to know about World Trade Center 7 is the BBC reported it before it happened. Flight 93 possibly was going to hit it until it was shot down allegedly by Lieutenant Colonel Rick Gibney of the North Dakota Civil Air Patrol. What do they call it there when you volunteer? Air National Guard. Air National Guard. So there was reports. It was reported that Rick Gibney, who was on NEAD's duty that day for Northeast Aerospace Defense, had shot a Sidewinder missile into Flight 93, knowing it was a hijack and it was headed toward a target. And then we got a different story of what happened on the plane and et cetera, et cetera. I watched that Flight 93 movie last night, brushing up for this interview. What's the propaganda about this? But the third building, if it was meant to come down in some sort of constructed fashion, had no triggering event other than BBC reporting it. Otherwise, I think they might have just waited till dark to bring the building down and nobody would have video of it to talk about today. So there's that.
There's a group of construction workers, very curious construction workers, walking away from Building 7, hearing an explosion over their shoulder in the afternoon of 9/11, looking back at the building over their shoulder, and then looking straight into the CNN camera and saying, "Did you hear that? That building's coming down. Flame and debris coming down. The building is going to explode." How do they know that? There's a few small scattered fires, which the fires department was told at about noon to stop. They weren't even fighting, but they were pulled out of the building because they were assessing it. And they were told not to fight the fires in the building. They were worried about structural damage was what they said. And so this is really curious, especially combined with the 11:07 report from CNN saying that a fireman came by and they said a 50-story building went down. Well, no other building went down besides these three skyscrapers. This was 11 o'clock that morning. Building 7 doesn't come down until 5:20. And as James mentioned, I think it was James, the BBC announced the collapse of this building 20 minutes before it ever happened. So leading a lot of researchers to speculate that that building was supposed to come down at that time in the morning, which would have been then completely obscured by the massive dust clouds released when the Twin Towers went down. So we can add that to our mix of our understanding of about what was the intent for Building 7 and the timing. Also, we have Barry Jennings and Michael Hess, who worked on the 23rd floor. Barry Jennings, the emergency command center, he was called up there, or he thought he was supposed to go there, so he went. Michael Hess is the attorney for Mayor Giuliani. After the building had been evacuated, which was after the towers were hit by the planes, but before they came down, and this was adamantly witnessed by Barry Jennings prior to his untimely and mysterious death. He claimed that before his rescue, they were blown back up into the 8th floor by bombs below. They also cite that the lobby had been destroyed by bombs. They also cite, Barry Jennings does, that he was walking over dead bodies in the lobby of Building 7 on his way out after having been rescued. So we can add this to the mix of fascinating.
That's the answer
testimony
that I was kind of looking for. I mean, clearly the damage that we're seeing in the afternoon could be the results of those explosions that Barry Jennings and Michael Hess were testifying to. Well, then another point, let me play devil's advocate while I'm doing it. Richard Gage, something that a lot of the so-called erstwhile debunkers would bring up in their assessment of WTC7 is that while it is, of course, demonstrably, visibly correct to say that the exterior of the building did come down in 7 seconds, and as NIST was forced to admit eventually, a good portion of that was at free fall acceleration. However, it is also demonstrable and visible that portions of the building were collapsing in some manner before that 7 second of the exterior coming down. We see that from the Pentagon, the penthouse collapse, seeming to initiate something within the building before the building exterior comes down, which adds to that 7 seconds. What can you say about that and how that plays into your assessment?
Yes, and I always show this particular piece of damage from this east penthouse 6 seconds prior to the overall building coming down. This east penthouse collapses. So what we're told by NIST is that that's a result of a structural failure down at the 12th floor, which we discussed earlier. But that would be impossible because unlike their model, their computer model, which shows failures all the way up from the 12th floor to the east penthouse 6 seconds earlier, the video shows nothing like that. There's no damage from the 12th floor up to the east penthouse. It's very clearly an isolated failure. For what reason, we don't know. Maybe they're mistimed explosions that weren't supposed to go off until later. Or maybe they're part of a deception. We don't know, but we don't see any daylight in the 47th or 46th story through windows that did break, indicating that the roof itself was maintaining its at some degree enough structural stability, integrity to keep daylight from getting through and shining out through those windows.
Tim Flynn is asking, did we answer what happens if the demolition is proven? Is it like the Martin Luther King Jr. civil case where they're awarded a dollar and it never hits the media? What do you think of that?
I'll let others tackle that.
Well, yeah, so this is the cynicism that I brought up earlier. It is, of course, I mean, after 18 years of failing to secure justice, it is easy to throw up your hands and just presume that the whole system is rigged and nothing will ever come of it. Obviously, if we do that, then nothing will ever come of it. So we have to continue trying. It is certainly a possibility that amazing things, amazing revelations have come out, for example, in the Martin Luther King case that get swept away and not part of the official narrative or the final word by the House Select Committee on Assassinations on the JFK assassination was, this is the final word of the US government so far, is it was the result of a conspiracy. So the Kennedy assassination, that is. So, I mean, some amazing things have happened over time that you wouldn't think would be able to be covered up, that are covered up. So it is a possibility, but hopefully what we have represented in the past 2 decades is a movement unlike anything that has existed in the past, in an age of not just mass media, but truly global, instantaneous communication that at least has the power, the potential to be peer-to-peer and unblockable in many different ways. We have manifested that, I think, in spreading 9/11 truth. That is one of the reasons why, well, it's certainly the reason why we are convened here electronically today. It's one of the reasons why 9/11 truth is a subject that has been pursued to this level. It might not have been possible to do this decades ago, or certainly not to the extent that we're doing it today. And so if and when remarkable events happen, if it fails to get out into the public consciousness, that to some extent is our fault, less so than waiting for Time Magazine or the New York Times or WNBC or whatever to televise or publicize those proceedings. We have to do it ourselves. And I think that's why things like the recent Fire Commission meeting and things like that are examples of ways that we can get this information out, regardless of what the mainstream media is doing with it.
And I think a big part of our job is just providing comparison and contrast. So we talked about the dust before, and it's an unimaginably huge number. If you just look at it like this, the World Trade Centers, let's say they're each 110 stories. Each floor is an acre of concrete. That's 220 acres of concrete that turns into dust in like 20 seconds. So first off, there's no way to replicate that on Earth as we know it with unclassified technology. There's no way to do it. I can't like take a yard of concrete and make it turn to dust without, with jet fuel, even with force coming down, right? And then the other aspect is everyone's been indoctrinated so heavily through the school system that when they perpetrate something like JFK or 9/11, Alan Dulles spoke it true. The American public doesn't read. But those who do, those who are analytical, those who look for the contradictions out of the official story and say, wait a minute, I can't just ignore those. They're glaring contradictions. And it's just the going back to the comparison and contrast and its power to unlearn the fear. It's like if you show somebody on day one, here's how they constructed these buildings. Here's the building of the World Trade Center. They still have that on YouTube. It's not censored yet. And then next day, here's the official story. And then the next day, yeah, here's why that can't be true, right? You spread it out over time, almost like an email drip sequence that people could get when they sign up at your site, Richard. So it would start to give them the power to articulate what they're learning to other people, because as James said, that's what we're here to do. We're here to stimulate that conversation, to trigger a little complexity in a nonviolent, non-aggressive way. But we're just saying there's a lot of things being done under the guise of 9/11, the Patriot Act, these wars on terror that are still going. We're still in Afghanistan because of 9/11. That's never going to end until more people can call bullshit. And they can't do that without the comparison and contrast. And that's kind of what we all provide in our own way to the audience.
Absolutely. And piggybacking on your example there of this concrete, 90,000 tons of concrete in each of these towers, it was spread out well outside the footprint of these buildings. And 100,000 tons of steel was spread out well outside the footprint of these buildings, up to 600 feet in every direction. So we only have a 2-story pile of twisted steel at the bottom of either of these towers. So if 90,000 tons of concrete didn't contribute to the force applied to cause the collapse, because it's outside the footprint, and 100,000 tons of steel didn't, then you tell me what caused the collapse of these buildings. That's most of the weight of the buildings right there.
I'm being mindful of the time. I know, James, if you've got to go,
I do have another interview lined up right after this, so I do have to go. But before I go, can I ask Richard Grove a question? I'm going off of memory here. I haven't listened to it recently, but I believe in your project Constellation, you said something to the effect of what you saw that morning of 9/11 contradicted the official account of what happened. And I believe you added some sort of tag like, what I did not see that morning also contradicted the official account of what happened on 9/11. Can you elaborate on that? What did you not see that morning?
Well, according to the official story, in hindsight, seeing the official story, I would have thought that I could have heard whatever airplane flew into the tower to cause that explosion, according to the official story. I was in a car. I was at 0 speed. I was in traffic. If I was going fast, it was at most 40 miles an hour. I had the top down. It's a beautiful sunny day. So if an airplane went screaming over my head and crashed into a building 20 blocks in front of me, my first thought was I should have heard some sort of, like, I should have heard something. In the Nade video, I think there's even sound to it. You can hear it coming, and the cameraman turns the wrong way. He doesn't turn toward the sound. He turns the other way perfectly to frame where the sound is going to be. So what I didn't see that morning were any planes, because from where I was when World Trade Center 2 exploded, according to the official story, that plane came in from the south, and my view was blocked. So that's why I didn't see that one. But I was still quizzical about how the building exploded like that from the official story. The first reports on the radio were a helicopter, like a small helicopter, and a Cessna, like a small plane. And both of those I thought were realistic explanations. So I didn't know anything about the planes until I saw the official story later on TV. So from my experience,
you put yourself in the no plane camp or agnostic, or what's your take on that?
I would have to go agnostic on that, meaning I don't have evidence on either side, because if you look into the official story and you play it by the law of identification, let's clear our desk and we can only put things on the evidence board that can be identified. A plane has like 6 different ways to identify its parts, its transponder, all these different things you can identify a plane. So how was Flight 11 identified that day? What parts or wreckage were found to identify it as Flight 11? All those, there's no answers to any of those questions. So you can't assume, you can't start your analysis or rationalization of the event on assumptions. But that's exactly what they did with World Trade Center 7. They're like, let's just start with a bunch of assumptions and make it the official story. So,
but to be clear, there is a difference between saying nothing was flying, nothing hit the building, and we don't know what hit the building. I mean, was it Flight 11 or was it another airplane? I mean, that's all
right. So let's go there. So did something hit the building? I didn't witness anything. So from my personal experience, I saw a building on fire. The cause of fire could have come from inside, not outside. I don't know what happened until the official story. And then they're saying that's what happened. And the Nade brothers, who filmed for the NSA and CIA officially now, they have the only footage of whatever happened at World Trade Center 1, North Tower.
Wow.
We're working on an FAQ on this issue because there's a lot of people out there asking questions about, did planes hit the towers or not, and which planes. They're 2 separate issues, as James pointed out. There's 43 videos, independent videos, that show planes hitting the towers, and the South Tower in particular, we're talking about now. And there's dozens of witnesses on tape, some of them live, seeing the second plane hit the tower while they're being interviewed about 9/11. So we're assembling all of that and putting it on our website. We've also done a forensic analysis, a quick one, that shows that the damage in the building is in fact consistent with a large plane-size object hitting the building.
So the next step of that, since large plane-size objects hit the building, how can we be certain what plane-size objects hit the buildings? Being that people involved had access to planes that looked just like that but they're
Right.
remote control and all these other Dobbs Act.
And also taking in the historical context of Operation Northwoods, where we
Yeah.
know they were going to switch out planes as part of deception operation.
And Operation Aphrodite, which is where Joe Kennedy Jr. was slated, or he was on a bomber that was a remote control bomber that was going to crash into a target. So they were going to use a plane as a destructive weapon, and he was supposed to parachute out, but for some reason the plane blew up before he went out, and that's how JFK became president.
Right. And we could also tie that into the research that's been done on the planes all having been hijacked in radar blind spots, as it were, so that.
Well, yeah. And then the Stewart Air Force Base, where 175 and Flight 11, I think, cross paths and their transponders and radar signatures disappear. And then they go back on after they cross over. The Air Force, Stewart Air Force Base is notorious for drug running.
Right.
And
okay, sorry, I do have to go, but just for the record, I just want to put my own viewpoint out there. I certainly think there is a large room for skepticism about what exactly hit the buildings. But as Richard says, there is an overwhelming amount of evidence that something flew into the buildings. So I'm very much looking forward to that. When and how will that FAQ be published?
We'll be publishing it on our website, and that will be within 2 or 3 months.
Looking forward to it. All right, guys, I got to go. I got another interview, but it's been a
Keep
slice.
your schedule. Be productive, James. We'll continue talking with Richard for a few minutes. Have a great day.
Right. Take care.
Thank you very much, James.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Coming full circle, Richard, if you got a few more minutes, here's another question from the Autonomy group, which I think ties into this. Igor Kreso, he's asking, why is this information relevant now 18 years later, and what legal, lawful implications could we hope for or expect as a result of this evidence being brought forward? Kind of a general question, but it kind of leads to the conclusion of where we want to go.
Yes. Well, everything changed after 9/11. We launched 2 major wars, which we're still in. The longest wars in human history. More than 7,000 or 8,000 U.S. soldiers have been killed. 2 million Afghanis and Iraqis have been killed. We have legislation and executive orders like the National Defense Authorization Act of 2012 and the Patriot Act, which allow our government to arrest us without a right to a lawyer, a trial, a jury, without due process. They can torture us and even assassinate us. This is all like legal now if you're associated with terrorism, which isn't even defined. So this is really not good. It is a long line of examples in the chain of false flag operations that governments have performed against their own people in an effort to manipulate them and blame it on another country as an excuse to go to war. And we're just going to allow this state of affairs to stand. We're going to continue to get what we're getting, such as false flag chemical attacks in Syria, false flag shootings across America, in an effort to manipulate us to give up our other rights, in those cases, the Second Amendment rights. Is this the kind of country you want your son or daughter or theirs to grow up in? Or are we willing to take a stand and say, thus far and no farther? The buck stops here. That's what I did 12 years ago when I was lied to on a colossal scale. Here I am, a flag-waving Reagan Republican, rooting for Colin Powell at the United Nations as he was making his case for weapons of mass destruction against Iraq. And I'm saying, let's go get those bastards, in Afghanistan who did this to us. And boy, was I fooled. Well, we all know that we were all fooled in Iraq. Some of us are waking up to being fooled in Afghanistan and Osama bin Laden and 19 fundamentalist hijackers, 8 of which are still alive, having been interviewed since 9/11. They left all kinds of clues behind. All we have to do is pick them up and expose them to the American people and let God do his work. We have to do ours, he does his. The timing is not guaranteed. But if we put one foot in front of the other and our hearts first before our anger and our fear, then we will prevail.
What are your thoughts on Jon Stewart's recent event where he went before the government and said and managed to get more compensation? I don't fully understand the details, but from what I understand, he actually seemed to have done a good thing. What do you think?
Well, he's waking people up to the needs to support our heroes, the firefighters who put out for us on that day and who are suffering as a result of the lies told to us by the EPA and our president and others. So Jon Stewart is in this respect a hero. If he wants to really be a hero, he'll step forward and blow the whistle on the whole 9/11 scam.
I'm sorry. I busted out laughing there. Only because Jon Stewart came to Hartford one time. I snuck into the theater. I mean, I didn't sneak in. I got permission from the guy guarding the door, and I gave him a package that had a bunch of 9/11 truthy type stuff in there. That was probably around 2008, so there could have been AE 9/11 MIT that I filmed for you out there, where everyone at the beginning believes the official story, and at the end, nobody believed the official story. Yeah. My naive hope was, hey, Jon Stewart's going to watch this package. He's going to talk about it on a daily show. People will know about 9/11 and the firefighters. And yeah, so if he does it today, that'd be cool. 20 years late.
Yeah.
Do you think if he was truly independent, he might do something like that? But I mean, he's controlled, isn't he?
No, his brother runs like stock exchange. His brother is a big Wall Street guy, so he's tied into the establishment, and he benefits from the establishment that did it. Unfortunately, that's why they keep it a secret, because they're the people who are participating at lower levels are all benefiting from it, and they don't know. Like they don't want to go and try to make their own way in the world and start their own business. They're on the gravy train. They're on the inside of the secret. They're not telling you. Like they know about chemtrails. They're working on the projects. They just say you're Looney Tunes for because. Smithsonian had been publishing this documents for it's like past 60 years that they're doing this. So if we can't know that there's a document and articulate it to somebody else such that they understand, the target of our conversation is either not a reasoning, conscious person, or we need to build our skills. I think it's a bit of both in all these different cases. We need to build our skills to be able to articulate our positions of research. And we also have to recognize some people aren't in the learning business. They're all set. They think they know, and that's good enough.
How you guys feeling? Richard Gage?
What's the question there, Chris?
Do you have time for a few more questions? How you feeling?
Sure.
Well, Daniel McCarthy asks, not to get too far out, but how can you explain what Judy Wood calls the dustification of the towers?
Well, there's a lot of dust associated with the towers. We saw in all the videos, you see 90,000 tons of concrete in each tower pulverized to a fine dust. The question is, what does that? And high energy explosives can do that. That's how they blow stuff up. We don't know exactly how they did it. There's no evidence that directed energy weapons can pulverize concrete powder any more than there's evidence that it can pulverize to a fine dust 100,000 tons of steel. In fact, the steel is not pulverized to dust. Much of it is softened in these 4,000 degree furnaces created by what we have evidence for, which is thermite, nanothermite. And the rest of it, which isn't softened, is blown in a 600-foot radius around each of the towers outside the footprint. So Judy Wood says that, well, there's no steel down at the bottom. Well, she's right. But there's 200,000 tons of steel all around and outside the boundary of World Trade Center towers. So it's not dustified. It's there in its full quantities. It's just not where you'd expect it to be in a gravitational collapse, which is what we're told by the official story.
Yeah, it had gone
So,
through
I hope-
the Merrill Lynch building, Deutsche Bank building, Millennium Hotel across the street. I mean, there's pieces of metal all over downtown. I mean, within not 2-block radius, but the materials all across the street and projected themselves through buildings, like sometimes through the other side. I think because there's the Winter Garden at the Merrill Lynch building, and a girder had come over the building and down through the roof of that. So you're talking almost 2 blocks away.
Yeah, more than 600 feet. It's extraordinary. I mean, these 4-ton structural steel sections are blown laterally at 80 miles an hour, clocked by physicists laterally, freely flying structural steel sections. How does that happen? This is enough energy to fire a 200-pound cannonball 3 miles, as calculated by physicists, and they're trailing thick white smoke clouds, the ends of these steel beams. Well, steel beams are not flammable, so they're not. You don't catch them on fire. It's not like wood. It's not burning unless something was set there on it to cause it to do just that. And what's missing in Judy Wood's directed energy weapons theory is the analysis of the dust, which is very, very detailed, and which, as we've discussed, reveals previously molten iron, not steel, microspheres, which is the evidence of thermite. What is not there is the evidence of steel dust. There's no steel dust in the dust. So if the steel was dustified, there would be steel dust documented in the dust by these independent agencies.
Got a good question here. Sorry, go ahead, Richard.
I was just going to say, it's a good question, Daniel, and it's an excellent answer, Richard, because I've studied Judy Wood's work. I try to remain agnostic on all these things and remain objective. And there are things about Judy Wood that I liked that she was looking at. Like there's a lot of energy that was released during that. So she had an angle on that. I think it's a recipe, a multitude of different techniques and effects, right? There's the thermite nanospheres, and there's like the molten upstairs, but then there's big, huge beams at the bottom cut at an angle, just like when they have cutting charges on pieces of metal. So you can put a cutting charge and it'll just cut the metal right there. So there are pictures with the firefighters in the rubble with these perfectly cut and melted pieces. And then if you go to the hangar and look at some of the stuff they didn't ship to China, the evidence, there's girders, huge girders and supports that are like tied like pretzels because they were turned to superheated molten almost, because they didn't lose their structure, but they definitely bent very freely and then cooled like that. So there's a multitude of different characteristics, and I don't think any one of the theories really, like, because if you look at the nuclear demolition theories, Kozelev and those guys, there are aspects of all these different things. So I think it's more of a layered Photoshop effect to get the final thing that we see. And that's why it's so hard to figure out, because it's not just one thing. They did a couple different things, and they did them very that show went off without a hitch that day.
There were a few hitches, actually, fortunately for us in the 9/11 Truth movement. But
World Trade Center
one
7's
of them,
that for sure.
Yeah, there's their biggest hitch right there, the smoking gun of 9/11.
Silverstein got greedy, that's all.
Judy Wood, one of the he may have, one of the things that bothers me the most about Judy Wood is that while providing literally no evidence for her theory, she denies the most scientific, basic forensic evidence that we have for thermite. On page 126 of her book, she just denies it, just flat out denies it. There's no thermite, there's no nanothermite. She denies the evidence for explosions, of which there's a couple of hundred witnesses of explosions all over the place, including the videos, which are very well documented. And she denies the evidence for this being a hot event. She says it's a cold event. because the Hutchinson effect is apparently a cold technology or science or experiment. But the evidence of extreme heat is everywhere and very well documented by numerous agencies, even of the federal government. So somebody who denies the most basic forensic evidence and provides no evidence for her own theory leads me to be suspect.
It's very well stated.
Richard, if you have a bit more time for a few more questions, this is a good one. Another one by Igor Krezo. He
Not getting any of that, are you, Richard?
Hey, yeah, it's all right. Chris, your audio got garbled for a second. You got a network hiccup.
Sounds like he's trying real hard, though.
He is. Those Texans try real hard when their internet goes out. That's how it works.
I've got 10 minutes also, Richard, if you can.
Let me see where Chris is coming back from.
He went to the moon.
Well, sound like he stopped trying.
Yeah.
All right, so I'll take the helm and wrap it up because you've got 10 minutes left on your schedule.
Right.
So September 11th is the press conference at the National Press Club. Am I correct?
Yes, 9:30.
And press is welcome at the press club.
Yes, that's why we're doing it.
Well, so many things are censored these days. I didn't know if press was still welcome at the press club or if they had special rules.
Reverse censorship. Yes. Also, we have a live stream of the event in UC Berkeley, which is September 5th at 3 o'clock in the afternoon Pacific time. UC will be putting that information out in all of our bulletins. So if you're not signed up, everybody, to our bulletins, they go out once a week or so from ae911truth.org. Just go and put your name and your email address in. Takes like 30 seconds.
And if you support ae911truth.org, they fund cool things like the Professor Leroy Halsey study at the University of Alaska. Am I correct? You were behind funding that project to actually get to answers instead of just talking about it. You guys funded something to get to answers?
Yeah, where did we get money like that? $300,000. Well, more than 300 or 400 people donated to make that happen.
That was very impressive because a lot of people, it actually made me think, what could we be funding in the future? Because that's a good study. World Trade Center 7 is a limited circumstance. You're not dealing with the towers. You're dealing with this thing that wasn't hit by a plane, and it's a government file cabinet that had SEC, Enron, IRS, CIA, all sorts of stuff in that building. And so it's a good aspect to just, you pound in your flag, you say, I'm standing here, I'm talking about this, and you talk about it as the how, and you compare it to the official story. I'm sure there's been a lot of opportunities to go off and follow red herrings and talk about the who or the why, but I want to congratulate you for just staying where you are, doing what you do, covering it, adding layers, getting more people to support it, improving your media. Your media production has improved so much over the years. And now going out to fund the University of Alaska study with Professor Leroy Halsey, that's a serious piece of work that took the actual data from the blueprints and rebuilt it. That's how you get answers. That's not what NIST did. So actually, I think you should get a refund from the government for doing the job that they actually use taxpayer dollars not to do.
Yeah, they spent about $5 million doing the Building 7 study. We spent $300,000, and it's open architecture. They won't release the input data for their computer models. They cited it might jeopardize public safety if we were to release it. Wait a minute. Doesn't it jeopardize public safety to withhold this information from the architects and engineers who are responsible with ensuring the public safety? We need that information.
Chris, are you back now? You want to Richard has to go because he's got schedule to keep. So I wanted to give you the opportunity now that your internet has cleared up to bring the show full circle so that we can go to the Discord and do Q&A over there.
Excellent. Well, Richard Gage, we really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today, and I hope it's been added value to everyone on both sides of the Zoom channel.
Yeah, absolutely. Really enlightening. I really appreciate the opportunity to engage with Richard Grove and James Corbett and you, Chris. It's pretty awesome.
Well, on behalf of the students, I know there's a lot of autonomy students and graduates here on the call. They get like the sneak peek into the background. This is live production and they get to hear and participate. And that's very exciting for them. And I'm, just speaking for them to say thank you for making time in your schedule and providing us with this copious amount of facts for consideration on this topic.
Yeah, appreciate it, Richard. So September 5th, we'll expect good news, hopefully.
Yep, you'll get some great news from UC Berkeley. Professor Leroy Halsey live streamed. Fire did not bring down this building. In fact, he shows what could have brought down the building. By God, if you take out all 80 columns on at least 8 floors at split-second timing, the building comes down exactly like the video. And he's going to show that with his computer model.
And in the meantime, we can maybe pursue Marcelo Gadiana. Maybe he could get that elevator report fast forwarded a little bit. That would certainly help.
I'll forward his info to Richard and you and James.
Excellent. Well, I think that's pretty much concludes our roundtable discussion. Yep, appreciate it, Richard Gage. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris, and thanks, Richard Grove. Really appreciate the opportunity.
Hey, you earn it. You're doing all that hard work out there. It's the least we could do to help shine a light on it.
Great news.
All right, and that's where we'll cut the end of the episode. And now we'll leave you on your way, Richard. Thank you.
All right, thanks, guys. You be well.
And for everyone else, I'm going to switch over to Discord so we can continue. We can use the live class chat audio channel for that. Just give me a few seconds and I'll click over there.